Hey there, I'm Zoey. I've always been good at reading people. It's probably why I became a psychologist. I had my own private practice and spent most of my waking hours helping others sort out their problems. Ironic, right? Considering what happened later. Anyway, there I was, approaching my late 30s, when it hit me like a ton of bricks. I wanted a family. Crazy how that sneaks up on you. My best friend, Sarah, must have sensed my sudden desperation because she offered to set me up with her second cousin. "Come on, Zoey," she said over coffee one day. "He's a great guy. Smart, funny, and he's got a good job. What be you got to lose?" I sighed, stirring my latte absently. "I don't know, Sarah. Blind dates aren't really my thing." She rolled her eyes. "It's not a blind date if I show you his picture first. Besides, you two can chat online before meeting. It's perfect." That's how I found myself friend requesting Mark on social media later that evening. To my surprise, we hit it off right away. Mark was 38, just a year older than me, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Our chats were easy, flowing from one topic to the next without any awkward pauses. We chatted for weeks before finally agreeing to meet in person. I was nervous as hell, palms sweating as I waited for him at the coffee shop we'd chosen for our first date. When Mark walked in, I felt my breath catch. He was tall, with kind eyes and a warm smile. He spotted me and waved, making his way over to my table. "Zoey?" he asked, extending his hand. I nodded, returning his smile. "That's me. It's nice to finally meet you in person, Mark." He sat down across from me, and just like that, the nerves melted away. We talked for hours, losing track of time until the barista politely informed us they were closing. As we walked out into the cool evening air, Mark turned to me. "I had a great time, Zoey. Would you like to do this again sometime?" I didn't hesitate. "I'd love to." And just like that, I found myself falling headfirst into a relationship with Mark. We started seeing each other regularly, going on dinner dates, walks in the park, and even a few weekend getaways. As our relationship progressed, I noticed something peculiar about Mark. His phone was constantly buzzing with messages. At first, I didn't think much of it. We all have busy lives, right? But the frequency was unusual, even for a popular guy. One night, as we lay in bed after a nice dinner, his phone lit up for what felt like the 100th time. I couldn't help myself. "Busy night, huh?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Mark glanced at his phone and smiled sheepishly. "Oh, it's just my mom. She likes to check in." I raised an eyebrow. "Your mom? At this hour?" He shrugged, looking a bit uncomfortable. "Yeah, we're pretty close. She raised me alone after my dad died when I was 5. I had pretty bad bronchial asthma as a kid. There were times she literally saved my life." I listened as Mark opened up about his childhood. The more he talked, the clearer the picture became. His mother wasn't just devoted, she was his entire world. "Sounds like you two have a special bond," I said, choosing my words carefully. Mark nodded enthusiastically. "We do. I owe her everything." As a psychologist, alarm bells were ringing in my head. The relationship Mark described sounded codependent, but I pushed those thoughts aside. I wasn't his therapist, I was his girlfriend. It wasn't my place to analyze their relationship. Weeks turned into months, and soon we'd been dating for nearly a year. Mark was sweet, attentive, and our relationship felt solid. But there was always this nagging feeling in the back of my mind about his relationship with his mother. One day, as we were having lunch at my place, Mark suddenly looked nervous. "Zoey," he began, fidgeting with his napkin. "I'd like you to meet my mom. I think you'll really like her. She's excited to meet you too." The next weekend, I found myself standing outside a modest 2-story house, my palms sweating. Mark squeezed my hand reassuringly as he rang the doorbell. The door swung open, revealing a petite woman with graying hair and Mark's kind eyes. She smiled warmly at us. You must be Zoey, she said, pulling me into an unexpected hug. I'm Helen. Come in, come in. As we settled in the living room, I couldn't help but notice how Helen's eyes never left Mark. She fussed over him, asking if he wanted a drink or a snack, completely ignoring my presence. I watched their interaction, feeling more like an observer than a participant. Helen dominated the conversation, constantly bringing up stories from Mark's childhood or fretting over his health. As we left a few hours later, I felt drained. Mark, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the awkwardness. So, what did you think? He asked eagerly as we drove away. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Your mom clearly loves you very much. Mark beamed. She's great, isn't she? I knew you'd like her. I forced a smile, not having the heart to burst his bubble. But as we drove back to my place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just witnessed something far more complex than a mother's love. 6 months flew by, and before I knew it, Mark was down on one knee, a sparkling ring in his hand. Despite my lingering concerns about his relationship with Helen, I said yes. I was in love, and I truly believed we could work through any issues together. We decided to move in together, into my apartment, of course. As we dove into wedding preparations, I quickly realized this wasn't going to be the fun, exciting experience I'd always imagined. Helen inserted herself into every decision, every detail. It wasn't just the wedding, either. Helen called constantly, always with some crisis that required Mark's immediate attention. One evening, as we were discussing flower arrangements, Mark's phone rang. He answered immediately, his face creasing with concern. What's wrong, Mom? The sink's leaking? I'll be right there. He hung up and turned to me apologetically. I've got to go help Mom. Her sink is leaking, and you know how she is with plumbers. This scene repeated itself almost daily. If it wasn't a leaky sink, it was a stubbed toe or a sad mood that only Mark could lift. And if he ever hesitated. After all I've done for you, Helen's voice would crack over the speakerphone. I just need a little help. Is that too much to ask? I couldn't take it anymore. One night, after Mark returned from yet another Helen emergency, I decided to broach the subject. Mark, I said gently, I think it might be helpful if we saw a couples therapist. Someone who could help us navigate this situation with your mom. I think her demands are a bit excessive. Excessive? Mark's voice rose. She raised me alone, Zoey. She saved my life multiple times. How can you call that excessive? I backpedaled, realizing I'd hit a nerve. I'm not saying she doesn't love you. I'm just worried about the impact on our relationship. Mark softened slightly. Okay, maybe you're right, but can we do it after the wedding? We're so busy right now, and I don't want to add more stress. I knew I should push harder, insist on addressing this before we tied the knot. But I was exhausted from fighting this invisible battle with Helen. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. The weeks flew by in a whirlwind of cake tastings, dress fittings, and endless phone calls with Helen. Before I knew it, we were just days away from the wedding. Despite the stress, I was excited. My friends had planned a bachelorette party, and I was looking forward to a night of fun without wedding talk or Helen drama. We hit our favorite bar, laughing and dancing. For the first time in months, I felt light, free from the constant tension of planning a wedding under Helen's watchful eye. Then my phone rang. Mark's name flashed on the screen. Zoey, his voice was tight with panic. Mom's in the hospital. Her blood pressure spiked. I'm heading there now. I quickly explained the situation to my friends and called a taxi. The ride to the hospital felt endless, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The moment Helen saw me, her face crumpled. Oh, she moaned, dramatically covering her face with her hands. It's you. My blood pressure, it's your fault. All this wedding stress. I froze, shocked by the accusation. Helen peeked through her fingers, her eyes narrowing at me. I can't handle this right now, my poor heart. Mark turned to me, his expression apologetic but firm. Zoey, could you wait outside? Just for a bit? Stunned, I nodded and walked out, collapsing into a chair in the hallway. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, nurses and doctors bustling past me. Finally, I stood up, determined to understand what was happening. I approached the nurse's station, using every ounce of my professional demeanor. Excuse me, I said to the doctor charting nearby. I'm Zoey, Helen Johnson's future daughter-in-law. Could you tell me about her condition? The doctor looked up, his expression neutral. Mrs. Johnson's blood pressure is elevated, but not dangerously so. We're monitoring her, but there's no immediate cause for concern. I took a deep breath, weighing my next words carefully. Doctor, I'm a psychologist. And I'm concerned that Mrs. Johnson might be dealing with some psychological issues. Has anyone evaluated her mental health? The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly. That's an interesting observation. We haven't done a psychological evaluation, but given what you're saying, it might be worth looking into. I'll make a note to refer her for an assessment. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. Thank you, doctor. I appreciate your help. Returning to my seat in the hallway, I waited a bit longer, hoping Mark would emerge. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized he wasn't coming out anytime soon. Defeated, I sent him a text, heading home. Call me when you can. I called another taxi and went back to our apartment. My phone buzzed with messages from my friends, asking where I'd disappeared to. I sent a quick apology, telling them to enjoy the rest of the night without me. It was past midnight when I heard the key in the lock. Mark shuffled in, looking exhausted. Hey, he said softly. You're still up. I sat up, trying to keep the hurt and anger out of my voice. How's your mom? He sighed, sinking into the armchair across from me. She's okay. They're keeping her overnight for observation. I stayed until she fell asleep. She was so upset, Zoey. She kept asking me not to leave her alone. I couldn't hold back anymore. Mark, do you really think that's all it is? Don't you see what's happening here? He looked at me, his eyes pleading. Zoey, please, not tonight. Can we just go to bed? I'm exhausted. I wanted to argue, to make him see reason. But looking at his tired face, I knew it was pointless. So I nodded, swallowing my frustration. The big day finally arrived. Mark pulled me aside just before the ceremony and took a deep breath. Look, I know things have been tense with Mom lately. But I've made some arrangements to keep her happy today. I just need you to go along with it, please? My heart sank. What kind of arrangements? Mark explained quickly. Helen had a special menu prepared for her, citing non-existent allergies. She'd be seated next to Mark at the head table, not with the other parents. The DJ had a list of her favorite songs to play. And, Mark added hesitantly, she wants to make a speech. I closed my eyes, counting to 10 in my head. Okay, I said finally. For you, for us. He kissed me gratefully, and I returned to my bridesmaids, plastering on a smile. The ceremony itself was beautiful. As I walked down the aisle, seeing Mark's face light up, I felt a surge of love that pushed all my doubts aside. For a moment, it was just us. The reception was an experience. True to Mark's word, Helen held court at our table, regaling everyone with stories of Mark's childhood. She barely acknowledged my presence, except to occasionally pat my hand condescendingly. When it came time for speeches, I watched in horror as Helen tottered up to the microphone, wine glass in hand. My dear friends and family, she began, her voice wavering. We're here to celebrate my only son's wedding day. She went on for what felt like hours, talking about Mark's childhood, his accomplishments, and how she'd sacrificed everything for him. I was mentioned exactly once, as an afterthought. As she finally wrapped up, Helen raised her glass. To my son, and his wife. May they be as happy as Mark and I have always been. I downed my champagne in one gulp. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We danced, we laughed, we cut the cake. And through it all, Helen hovered, always ready to interject herself into every moment. The wedding is over, but as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, nothing changed. Helen called every day, sometimes multiple times a day. There was always some crisis, some reason she needed Mark's immediate attention. One day, as he grabbed his keys, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Mark, we need to talk about this. It's not healthy, for any of us." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, you're right. We should see someone. A therapist, like you suggested. Let's look into it this weekend." But when the weekend came, there was always some reason to postpone. Helen needed help with her grocery shopping. The lawn needed mowing. The cat needed to go to the vet. And so it went, week after week. Empty promises and endless excuses. 3 months into our marriage, I was at my wit's end. The constant intrusions from Helen, Mark's unwillingness to set boundaries, and the strain on our relationship were taking their toll. When my vacation time came around, I saw it as a golden opportunity. "Mark," I said one evening, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice, "let's go on a honeymoon. Just the two of us, away from everything. What do you say?" To my surprise and relief, Mark's face lit up. "That sounds amazing, Zoey. Where do you want to go?" We spent the next hour excitedly planning a tropical getaway. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. This was our chance to reconnect, to remember why we fell in love in the first place. "I'll take care of everything," Mark promised. "The flights, the hotel, all of it. And when we get back, I promise we'll deal with the situation with Mom. Maybe look into that therapy we talked about." The day of our departure arrived, and I was practically bouncing with excitement as we drove to the airport. Mark seemed a bit distracted, but I chalked it up to pre-flight jitters. As we approached the check-in counter, Mark handed me my boarding pass. I glanced at it, then did a double take. "Economy?" I asked, confused. "I thought we were flying together." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, about that. I had some credit card bonuses I could use, but there was only enough for one first-class ticket. I figured since I'm taller, it made sense for me to take it. It'll save us money overall." I stared at him, hurt and bewildered. "But, it's our honeymoon. Couldn't we have both flown economy and sat together?" "Come on, Zoey," he said, a hint of irritation in his voice. "Don't make a big deal out of this. It's just a few hours." Swallowing my disappointment, I tried one last time. "Okay, well, can I at least come to the first-class lounge with you before the flight? We could pay extra." "No," Mark cut me off quickly. "The ticket's in my name. They won't let you in. Look, I've got to go check in. I'll see you on the other side, okay?" Before I could respond, he was gone, wheeling his suitcase towards the first-class check-in. Feeling deflated, I made my way through security and to the regular boarding lounge. As I sat there, trying to salvage my excitement for the trip, a familiar figure caught my eye. There, just outside the first-class lounge, I saw a flash of graying hair and a floral dress that looked suspiciously like something Helen would wear. My heart started racing. Was I imagining things? Had the stress of the past few months finally made me paranoid? But Mark's strange behavior, his insistence on flying first class alone, his refusal to let me into the lounge, it all suddenly made a horrible kind of sense. Before I could talk myself out of it, I marched up to the first-class lounge desk. "Excuse me," I said, pulling out my credit card. "I'd like to purchase access to the lounge, please." The attendant looked skeptical, but processed my payment. As she handed me the access card, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I might find. I pushed open the door to the lounge, my eyes scanning the plush seats and buffet tables. And there, in a quiet corner by the window, sat Mark and Helen, heads close together over cups of coffee. They looked comfortable, like they were embarking on their own little adventure. I took a deep breath and strode towards Mark and Helen, my heels clicking loudly on the polished floor. They both looked up as I approached, and I saw the color drain from Mark's face. "Zoey," he exclaimed, jumping to his feet. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, my voice ice cold. "Care to explain why you're here with your mother instead of your wife?" Mark glanced nervously around the lounge. "Zoey, please," he said in a low voice. "Let's not do this here. I can explain everything after we land, I promise." Before I could respond, Helen chimed in, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Oh, Zoey dear, what a surprise. Mark and I are just about to take off for a lovely first-class trip together. Isn't that nice? But what are you doing in this lounge?" Mark stepped between us, his face a mask of guilt and fear. "Zoey, I'm sorry. The truth is, there were enough bonus points for 2 first-class tickets. I thought Mom deserved a nice trip, and what about me, Mark?" I practically shouted, no longer caring about the scene we were causing. "I'm your wife. We're supposed to be starting our life together, but instead, you're jetting off with Mommy dearest while I'm shoved in economy like an afterthought." The lounge had gone completely silent. Every eye was on us, but I was beyond caring. "Do you have any idea what it's been like these past few months?" I continued, years of frustration pouring out. "The constant calls, the emergencies, the way you always put her first. And now this? How could you do this to me?" Mark reached out to touch my arm, but I jerked away. "Zoey, please," he pleaded. "You need to calm down. We can work this out. Once we're on vacation, we'll have time to talk, to get closer. We can fix this, I promise." I stared at him, suddenly feeling very calm and very, very tired. "Fix this?" I repeated quietly. "Mark, there's nothing left to fix. I'm going home and I'm filing for divorce." Mark's jaw dropped. "Divorce? Zoey, you can't be serious." But Helen cut him off, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. She stood up and linked her arm through Mark's. "Well, if that's how you feel, dear, I think it's for the best. Come along, Mark. We don't want to miss our flight." I watched in stunned silence as Helen led Mark away. He looked back at me once, his expression a mix of regret and relief, before they disappeared through the boarding gate. For a moment, I just stood there, feeling the weight of dozens of curious stares. Then, without a word, I turned on my heel and walked out of the lounge. As I made my way through the airport, my mind was oddly blank. I should have been crying, screaming, feeling something. But all I felt was a strange sense of liberation. I spent the next few hours gathering Mark's belongings. Clothes, books, the silly knickknacks his mother always bought him. I packed it all up methodically, my mind oddly calm. When I was done, I called a courier service and had everything sent to a nearby storage facility. The next day, I contacted a divorce lawyer. As I signed the preliminary paperwork, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. This was the right decision, I knew it in my bones. Instead of wallowing, I decided to use my vacation time for myself. I redecorated the apartment, erasing all traces of Mark. I reconnected with old friends, started yoga classes, and spent long hours reading books I'd been meaning to get to for years. A month passed, and my phone buzzed with a message from Mark. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. "Zoey, please, can we talk?" I typed out a brief response. Storage facility number 247. Access code 8891. Your things are there. Divorce papers have been sent to your mother's address. Please sign and return them. Then I blocked his number. Returning to work was like a breath of fresh air. I threw myself into my practice with renewed energy. My experiences, painful as they were, had given me new insights into codependent relationships. I channeled this knowledge into a series of research papers, carefully anonymizing the details. To my surprise and delight, these papers caught the attention of the psychology department at the local college. They invited me to give a guest lecture, which turned into an offer for a part-time teaching position. It was at the college that I met James. He was a fellow professor in the psychology department, tall, with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. We bonded over shared research interests and a mutual love of terrible puns. As the weeks passed, James and I grew closer. He was everything Mark wasn't: independent, respectful of boundaries, and wonderfully self-assured. He had a teenage daughter from a previous marriage, and watching him balance his role as a father with his career and our budding relationship was a revelation. One evening, as we were grading papers together, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, my old friend who had originally set me up with Mark. "Hey Zoey," it read. "Thought you should know, Mark's still living with Helen. If anything, they seem even closer now. I'm so sorry for my part in all this. Hope you're doing okay." I stared at the message for a moment, then set my phone aside. James looked up, concern in his eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked. I smiled, realizing that for the first time in a long time, I truly was all right. "Yeah," I said. "Everything's fine." And it was. Mark and Helen's relationship was no longer my problem. I had my own life to live, my own path to follow.